Morning and welcome. I'm John Vasconcellos, member of the California Legislature. I hail from Santa Clara County up north, which I believe with Orange County are the two frontier counties of California. So I'm pleased to be here this morning with you to co-host with the university, its social ecology group, its global conflict cooperation group, and other groups here on campus, this symposium, which began yesterday and goes through this afternoon toward a healthier state, California 86. It is a fine example, I believe, of what California needs to develop, which is a collaboration between the legislature and the university, two institutions which together can truly help Californians better envision and develop and practice a healthy future. Yesterday, your Chancellor, Jack Peltison, opened the first piece of the symposium, which was on the AIDS epidemic, with UCI researchers and public policy education people. This morning we have a session on peace. This afternoon we have a session on self-esteem. Starts at 2 o'clock. Briefly, yesterday one of the reporters said, "Isn't this a mishmash? Why do you have self-esteem and AIDS and peace together?" I said, it's not a mishmash. It is rather outgrowing the old traditional single-issue piecemeal approach and beginning to recognize that our future depends upon our envisioning broadly the components of a healthier state. They're economic, they're educational, they're family, they're social, they're personal, political, and they include world survival and peace. And so over the past year, we have developed this program. There are some brochures. I'd encourage you to take one when you leave, called Toward a Healthier State, California 86, an effort to bring into the public arena a belief and practice of politics, not electoral or partisan, but personal and community and statewide, that founds itself upon a deep faith in our own human capacities to be faithful, to be hopeful, to be loving, to be cooperative, and to truly inspire each other, not to be cynical and hypocritical and divisive, like too much of politics has been in both parties, especially in these last elections, but instead to create a different kind of politics that truly emerges from our decent sense of our own goodness, our willingness to trust ourselves and each other, to open ourselves to each other, and to begin to build the kinds of hopeful alternatives and peaceful alternatives that truly enable Californians and hopefully the whole world following suit to realize the promise that our state is and to realize our own personal, individual, human potential and promise. So I'm delighted. We had a symposium on this program at the University of Southern California last March. We had one at Holy Names College in Oakland in September. Here at Irvine now, it is a growing movement. It is a successful movement that depends upon each of us committing ourselves to living more faithfully, more generously, more trustingly. And we're pleased to have you here this morning. And I'm pleased especially to introduce this morning's introducer, Elizabeth Tierney, a recently met and a good friend of mine, a dear woman who has long been a teacher and counselor, and most recently has been one of the founding donors of the chair here at UCI in Peace Studies. It is only the second such chair in the whole U.S. The first was at Yale, I'm told, has not ever been filled. The regents at the university are going to next week meet, I believe, to approve this grant and to approve the chair and begin a worldwide search for the first and best person to lead the effort here at UCI to be the frontier in California and for the country in peace studies. And I'm proud and pleased to introduce to you Elizabeth Tierney.
John. Well, Carl Rogers is renowned, to say the least, in the field of psychology. In fact, it's absolutely impossible to take a psychology course in which you don't study Rogerian theory, client-centered therapy, and Dr. Rogers' model of self-disclosure. He is the original pioneer of humanistic psychology. And for longer than I've been alive, he's been a practicing therapist, a teacher, and an author. And recently he's taken on a new dimension in his work. the role of peace facilitator. This role has taken him to South Africa, to Central America, and most recently to the Soviet Union. I'd like to read you a statement that Carl Rogers made in 1982. Happened to be his 82nd year. It says, quite a remarkable statement. It seemed a little foolish and yet at times to be thinking of starting the peace project at my age. And yet I, like many others, feel that at the present time, the problem of preventing a nuclear holocaust has top priority in my mind, in my heart, and in my work. And that's why I'm devoting myself to this project. Looking around this room, I see a lot of faces of people who've made similar commitments in their life. It's really the audience today that I'd like to introduce to Carl Rogers, because he told me he was curious about you. I'd like you to raise your hand if you're a high school student. I have high school students here today. If you're in the field of education, raise your hand. A lot of educators. And I know that many of you have traveled to be here today. Those of you who've come from the Los Angeles area and San Diego. And how many of you are presently engaged in the peace movement in some way? Well, Dr. Rogers, that's who we are. We've really come together today out of respect and trust and hope. And that's respect for your work, Dr. Rogers, and trust in your personhood, and hope for our future and the future of the world. So we bid you welcome, and we wish you peace. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, and appreciate especially knowing a little bit about who you are. What I want to talk to you about this morning is a person-centered approach to peace. I feel that we've developed a distinctive way of helping divergent and hostile groups meet with one another, come to understand one another. And I want to try to really present that in a fairly organized way. I've been encouraged to talk somewhat about the theoretical background of our work, and I really would like to do that. I don't often do that. So the first part I'm going to speak about is the theory that underlies this approach to peaceful dialogue. And then we'll probably we'll have some questions and then take a break. And then in the second portion, with the help of John Vasconcelos and Gay Swenson, who were there, I want to talk about the experience of bringing together international leaders focused on the issue of Central America, because that was a very important workshop that we conducted just about a year ago. Then the last part of the morning I want to devote to talking about the workshops I've conducted in South Africa and in the Soviet Union. Both very exciting places to be. I'm going to refer quite a little to my notes because I really do want to make a fairly organized presentation. And if sometimes I try to read something and it's rather laborious, it's not because I'm stupid, it's because I can't see well enough to read well. I just wanted you to know that. I think that for more than 30 years, almost everything I've done has been in the service of testing a very significant hypothesis. That hypothesis was drawn from my experience in therapy and the experience of colleagues. But I would like to emphasize that it's not an armchair theory, it's something that's drawn from the effort to try to integrate our experience in psychotherapy. In fact, I might read one paragraph. There was a chapter I wrote quite a long while ago on a very rigorous statement of my theory that I've been referring to recently. I haven't really read it in a long time, and I find that I'm surprised at how up-to-date it sounds. When I got to the part on the theory of therapy, here was the opening paragraph. This theory is of the if-then variety. If certain conditions exist, then a process will occur which includes certain characteristic elements. If this process occurs, then certain personality and behavioral changes will occur. This will be made specific. And then I went on to specify about 6 of the elements which made up the conditions making for therapy. I think about a dozen characteristics of the process that ensued, and even more characteristics of the outcomes that result. And so I want to talk about the different aspects of that. I might say that theory started from and was initiated by our experience in one-to-one psychotherapy, but it hasn't remained there. It's been extended to the field of education, where some of the same kind of conditions produce accelerated learning. There's been some very interesting research in that field. And it's been extended to the field of management. I'm always somewhat surprised at the degree to which management these days is, in many instances, coming closer and closer to the kind of conditions that we feel make for growth. It's been extended into the field of racial conflict, both in this country and in South Africa, to help bring together very divergent, very hostile groups. It's been extended to international leaders, and that's what we were able to do in this conference in Rust, Austria, which focused on the issues of Central America. It may seem strange that we held the conference in Austria if it was about Central America, but that's a story in itself. Then it's also been extended to many, many cultures. This past year, within the past 12 months, there was this conference on Central America, which included representatives from about 17 nations. Then in South Africa, a colleague and I were dealing with black-white groups, about equal numbers of each. Then during the summer, I was involved in a cross-cultural conference in Hungary, a 10-day workshop, which included about 20 different nations, a number of them from the Eastern Bloc countries, as well as from Europe and the US. And then a 4-week trip to the Soviet Union. I just got back from there a couple of weeks ago. So we've had quite a lot of experience in testing this hypothesis in a wide variety of situations with very divergent groups in different cultures, different nations, because we've also worked in Brazil and Italy and Japan and various places. I guess I'd like to say that this approach, this hypothesis that I want to talk about, this theory that I want to try and spell out a little bit, is quite unique in a couple of very significant ways. One is its view of human nature, and I'll speak about that in just a minute. It has a different view of human nature than most of our current institutions. And the second thing is that it is based on learning, which is both experiential as well as cognitive. That's something that seems very hard for universities to accept. Most of the universities I know, I'm not speaking of this university because I don't know it, but most of the universities I know think that education goes on from the neck up, and only from the neck up. And that's just not, education may be limited to that, but learning is something else again. Significant learning involves experiencing things as well as intellectual learning about them. And the approach that I'm talking about puzzles many academic people because they don't quite understand that significant learning is both experiential and cognitive, and that's one of the key aspects of the approach that I'm going to that I'm talking about. So, what are some of these conditions that make forward movement, make growth, make development, make healing more possible? I'm going to put them in quite formal ways, then I'll talk about them a little more personally too. First of all, it's necessary that people be in contact. I'll talk about this as I'm speaking about therapy, but it also applies to dealing with groups as well. First of all, it's necessary for people to be in contact. I think it's much desirable for them to be in face-to-face contact. Possibly some other approaches might work, but certainly phone conversations or something like that is really not equal by any means. Then a second condition is that the client person must be someone who is feeling some concerns. Technically, I would say is a person who is experiencing incongruence. There's a split between the image he has of himself, his self-concept, and what he is experiencing. He may feel, I'm a good person, but here I'm doing these awful things. Or he may feel, I'm really terribly inadequate. So how did I get such a good mark on that exam? Well, then he has to figure, well, that was a fluke. It really wasn't me. I didn't do it. You have to some way or other reconcile experience and the concept of self. But for therapy to take place, there has to be some degree of conflict, some degree of inner difference, some expression of concern. It wouldn't be feasible to do therapy with somebody who is perfectly satisfied with himself or his group or whatever. Then it's necessary that the therapist be congruent, that the therapist, the facilitator, the therapist, the helping person, necessary that that person be what he is, that whatever he's experiencing inwardly be present in awareness and available for expression if that seems appropriate. In other words, he's all in one piece in the relationship. Doesn't mean he has to be a perfect person. It means that for the time that he is functioning as facilitator or therapist, which is fortunately a limited time, he can be at his best. He can be a person who is wholly present in the relationship. Somehow presence has come to mean a great deal to me in recent years, because I realize that sometimes, well, I know that it seems to me that over the years in groups, and somewhat true in therapy, I speak much less than I used to, yet I seem to get even more dramatic results. And the only thing I can attribute that to is that when I am in such a relationship, I'm right there. I'm really present. And whenever I'm present, interesting things happen. Then, I think I said before that was necessary. That's not quite true. These conditions I'm talking about, if they are present, it is more likely that growth will occur. Oh yes, and that brings me to one other thing I want to bring in. This whole model and theory operates on a growth model, not a medical model, and that's a very important difference. Most therapy and many attempts to deal with differences and so on are based on a medical model, where you diagnose, you label, you prescribe, you treat. And your aim is to try to bring the person back to normal, back to average, so that he or she is not sick, not ill. That's not the model that I think makes any sense in dealing with psychological issues or dealing with conflicts between groups. We're talking about a growth model where the aim is to help the individual to remove whatever blocks to growth exist and continue on the normal functional road. Therapist person be experiencing a real caring, or technically an unconditional positive regard. What that means is that the client person is being prized as he or she is. It doesn't include a lot of ifs. It doesn't say, well, I like you a lot if you behave in this way, or I really care for you, providing you do such and such. No, it's an unconditional caring, where you care for the person regardless of the behavior of the moment. You care for the core of the person, is what I think. And if that kind of an attitude or that kind of a way of being is present, then therapeutic change is more likely. Then the other very important condition in the therapist is that he be experiencing an empathic understanding, a very sensitive appreciation of the inner world of this individual or group that he or she is dealing with. If there's time, I want to talk more about that, because people so often feel, yes, I listen, I know what you're talking about. Well, maybe you do. Really sensitive, empathic understanding, where you understand without judging, where you just understand what it's like to live in the world of this other person. That is something so rare that it's really very precious. It ought to be regarded as we regard our precious gems and precious metals and all, because it's something very rare in this world, and it has an enormously releasing effect. Then the only other condition that I'm aware of is that the client person needs to be aware of, at least to a minimal degree, of these attitudes of genuineness and caring and sensitive understanding. And if those conditions are present, then change is definitely likely. Now, the condition that is sort of implied in that, but I haven't specifically mentioned, is that all of this makes no sense unless there is a basic trust in the trustworthiness of the human organism. What we're trying to do by setting these conditions is to release the individual, to release the potential for growth. That doesn't make much sense if the human being is essentially evil or essentially destructive. So that's one way in which this is a really radical point of view. It runs contrary to a lot of religious teaching. It runs contrary to Freudian thinking, where the wild and must be tamed. That runs absolutely contrary to my experience over many, many years. I have found that if you can get to the core of the individual, you discover something constructive, not destructive. People say, oh, then you believe man is good. Well, I don't quite like the term good. That's a value judgment. For example, we don't say a plant, well, let me just, I'll put it in positive terms. We look at a plant. We don't decide that it's evil by nature. We just take it for granted that given the right conditions, it will grow, it will blossom, it will produce its normal life. We don't think that way about animals. It's only people that we think, well, you get to the basis of the human being and that's evil. That has not been my experience. I've certainly dealt with plenty of people who are doing evil things, who are doing things that are socially destructive. But if you can get behind that shell, if you can get to know the person inside, you find a person who would like to live in harmony, who really is constructive in nature. And that's the essential basis of the whole theory and model that I'm talking about. Again, referring to the theory that I wrote a long time ago, I want to mention the first few elements that I described in the process. If you can create the conditions that I've spoken about, or if they exist, then a certain process begins to take place. You find in therapy that the client becomes increasingly free to express feelings, and that's very true in groups as well. If you can create this kind of a climate, then gradually more and more personal feelings come out, more and more personal stories, more and more attitudes that have been kept under wraps. You'll find that the feelings that are expressed relate increasingly to the self, and that's quite understandable, because if the person is being met with a sensitive, empathic understanding, then he or she realizes someone understands what it's like to be me. And so then that brings a whole rush of expression of feelings about me. People are hungry to have someone else understand the person they are. And so you get more feelings about self. The feelings are increasingly relevant to the conflict that exists. Sorry about that. The feelings that are expressed in regard to self are increasingly relevant to whatever the conflict is. And this is true in groups too, that gradually, after more personal expressions, the differences become sharper, more clearly expressed. So, in individual therapy, it's the difference between the concept of self and what the person is experiencing that comes to be explored. Then I want to say a few words about the transition of this from individual therapy to broader scope. In individual therapy, the therapist is quite accustomed to dealing with conflict, but in that case it's inner conflict, where the person feels, part of me wants to do this, but part of me certainly wants that. Or my mind tells me that this would be the sensible thing to do, but my gut says, no, I want to do something quite different. So the therapist is accustomed to understanding and accepting and not judging the different parts of the individual, the different sides of the conflict that exists within. And that's why the whole theory is very easily adapted to group conflicts, because there too the therapist can recognize, I see, you feel absolutely that this is right, and you feel that exactly the opposite is right, and can be acceptantly understanding of both opposing points of view. And that has many significant effects. It means that it tends to diffuse the irrational aspects of what's been felt. Because no matter how strong your feeling, if someone understands how you feel, okay, then there's no need to defend it. You're understood, so you can kind of look at what you're feeling more objectively. Also, if you are understood by a facilitator, then your opposite number, the person who feels very differently, can begin to see, oh, there is something understandable about your point of view. I didn't think there was. And so little by little you see a dissolving of the irrational aspects of conflict, and people becoming more realistic about the things on which they really differ. Also, having become more personal, the degree of mutual understanding grows, especially when they see the facilitator understanding different aspects of the personal stories. Then one begins to realize, oh, this other group is not just composed of them, it's composed of persons, and I really begin to understand those persons. And when you understand persons, you can't help but respect them, because they're really worthy of respect. And so out of what initially is conflict, you get a process whereby the group becomes more understanding of one another, more respectful of one another. And that leads to a feeling that there is some unity in us, we aren't entirely conflict. It also means that if you understand this other group as persons with whom you differ, then whatever the differences are become much more soluble. It's only when you're looking at them as those awful people feel this and they're all wrong, then the conflicts are really insoluble. But when you realize they're not awful people, they're persons like myself, it's just that they hold different points of view, and maybe my point of view isn't entirely correct, and then you begin to realize some of the differences may be soluble. That's what happens in dealing with these very divergent groups. That leads me to speak of the kind of outcomes that can be expected. And again, I'm going to speak in part from this much earlier write-up of theory. And again, I'll drop back to speaking about therapy, but you can keep in mind that this also applies to groups as well. The client becomes more open to his experience. It's partly because if you're understood, if you're accepted, then defensiveness is less necessary. So you can be more open to all the stimuli within, you can be more aware of your own feelings, you can be more aware of the other person's feelings. You're more open to experience. And because of that, because now you're aware of more of what's going on, you become more realistic and more objective. There are not so many irrational aspects to your thinking and feeling. Because you are more realistic and more open to all the factors in the situation, you're much more effective in problem solving, because now problems are looked at as they are, not with a real overlay of defensiveness and projection and so on. Then there are changes in the self-structure. This is one thing that we've studied a lot and on which some very sophisticated research has been done. We found, for example, that the image the person has of self changes rapidly during therapy. The image he has of the self he would like to be, that changes relatively little. What happens during therapy is that that the self becomes more like the self that was wanted or desired at the beginning of therapy. It's quite interesting to know that we don't change too much in what we want to be. What we change is what we are, and that can be quite excitingly measured by research procedures. Because of these various changes, there's a reduction in both physiological and psychological tension in the individual. Less defensive, more open to experience, there isn't so much to be threatened by, so there's that occurs. There's less vulnerability to threat, because you're safe enough now that you're not so easily threatened. There's a change in the attitude toward the self. People come to like themselves better. They're more appreciative of themselves as they are. There's more self-direction. People are empowered, really, and this occurs certainly in therapy and also in groups, that they are empowered to direct themselves. They feel trusted. They begin to trust themselves, and so they're much more self-directing. Part of what goes on is that now, because they're more realistic, they perceive others with greater accuracy and perceive the feelings of others with greater accuracy, and that's helpful in bringing about understanding. And because of that, they become more accepting of others. Their behavior becomes more uniquely their own, and because they like themselves and because they're willing to be their own unique selves, they become more creative. So those are some of the outcomes that occur in therapy, and they also occur, we find, in dealing with groups. I'll just simply mention the fact that when that original theory was written, it was published in 1959, so it really is old stuff. There was a section on the conditions which would reduce group conflict, and that's, I realize, is what we've been working on in recent years and filling out. There were also something about the process of reduction of group tension, and I think I've really said enough about that. I would say that one distinctive thing about this whole theory that I'm talking about is that when expressed in rigorous terms, as it has been, it's amenable to research. Every term that we've used is carefully defined so that if you want to measure it, you know what you're measuring. If you want to investigate it, you know what you're investigating. And there's been a lot of confirmatory research in regard to individual therapy. We find that by and large, it is true that when these conditions do exist or are created, then personality and behavioral change takes place. There's been exhaustive research in the field of education. Dave Aspie and Flora Roebuck and their colleagues studied teachers in classrooms, north, south, black, white classrooms, Israel, I think 6 or 7 different countries, and found that they studied a wide variety of elements, but they found that the factors that were most closely related to accelerated learning were attitudes very much like those I described. When the teacher really cared for the children as persons, when the teacher was real and genuine, wasn't wearing a teacher face or something like that. When the teacher was able to understand what the learning experience was like for the student, and that's something very rare. They tried to reproduce this study in Germany, and they did so. One thing they found difficulty with was that the number of really understanding responses given by teachers to students was so rare it was hard to count. And that, I think, is probably true pretty much in this country, too. Anyway, the study in Germany confirmed the study by Aspie and Roebuck that these attitudes did seem to be the significant ones. I might mention that in recent years, many of the studies about individual therapy and about groups comes from West Germany, especially from the University of Hamburg, where they've studied all kinds of ways of application. Can you train elementary school students so that they understand something of this way of being, and does that help them when they're leading after-school groups? Yes, it does. Can you train college students so that they can visit with elderly people in nursing homes for 1 hour a week? And does that make any difference in the behavior and attitude of these elderly people? Yes, it does. They've studied all kinds of very different ways in which this theory might be applied, and they're really, some of the research has been very interesting. I think I want to stop in just a moment and open it to questions. I just want to say one more word about empathic listening. I said that it was often misunderstood, and I think it is. It's regarded superficially, it's regarded as passive for one thing. Well, then you just sit back and listen. You know, to be really empathic is one of the most active things I know. To try to really understand what it feels like to this person in this situation. What does it feel like to be an abused child? What does it feel like not to be able to read? What does it feel like to be in a marriage where you're totally unhappy and yet see no way of getting out of it? What does it feel like to have bizarre thoughts and hallucinations and so on? To really let oneself go into the inner world of this other person is one of the most active, difficult, demanding things that I know. And yet it is worth it because it is one of the most releasing, healing things that I've had any occasion to use or be. It's one of the reasons why I love doing therapy. It's one of the reasons why I love dealing with very difficult situations like the racial conflict in South Africa. To try to really relate to things that are quite out of my experience and yet not out of my experience. That's one thing that makes empathy possible, is the fact that there isn't an infinite number of feelings. There's quite a finite number of feelings you can have. It can be rage, it can be love, it can be fear, but it's finite. And so though you may never have been enraged about this situation, you know what rage is, you've felt it. You may not quite understand what it's like to be as joyous as this person is, but you know what joy is, you've felt it. You may not be quite as frightened of life as this person is, but you know fear. So that's what makes empathy possible. It's what makes it possible to enter the world of this other person. The other thing that makes it possible is if you're reasonably secure within yourself so that you can really let yourself go into the world of this other person, and yet know that you can return to your own world too. Everything that you're feeling is as if. I can feel as if I'm as frightened as you are. I can feel as if I'm as angry as you are. But I know that I can come back to myself, which at that moment is not frightened or is not angry. And so that's... I just wanted to say that because I think sensitive empathy is one of the least understood elements in this whole approach. And so, I don't know, I'll be glad to answer questions if there are some questions, answer a few questions, and then we'll take a break.
Carl, could we ask people to come up here to ask the question at the
Good.
microphone so
Very
everyone
good.
can hear?
Very good.
So you're welcome to come up.
So then you will be recorded for all eternity.
I heard Krishnamurti actually quoting you about this idea of not putting people into boxes and putting an image on someone saying, don't be stupid, you're lazy, you're this. But as a teacher, I find it hard to say, don't do this, you're acting silly. How do we change behavior but not say you're just this or that? Thank you.
It is difficult. It's very difficult. And I think that I'll go back to what I said about therapy. During a therapeutic hour, I can really refrain from that. I don't always refrain from it otherwise. It's almost impossible not to label people at times. We can, however, get better at not labeling them. And one thing that helps is to try to learn to appreciate persons. One of the things that I've said and written that people seem to really respond to is the notion that it is possible to appreciate a person. You know, you look at a sunset and you don't say, well, it'd be better a little more purple over there. And after all, this is a rather lazy sunset, or this is seems to be quite incorrigible. No, we don't say that. We say, look at that sunset, and we appreciate it. We can appreciate persons in that same way, and the more we can appreciate persons and come to really appreciate their uniqueness, then I think the less likely we are to label them, although we're going to label them sometimes in spite of ourselves. But the more we can avoid labeling, I think the better off we are in any kind of personal relationship, classroom, marriage, child rearing, anything.
To say it's really a thrill or a pleasure to be in your presence again. After 40 years of following your life, it's really a pleasure to be by you. Erich Fromm, as you remember, some years ago after he wrote The Art of Loving, wrote a book about the characteristics of nations, of countries. At that time, I think he labeled Russia as being paranoid. And I'm wondering, with your recent experience in dealing with many different people in different countries, if you could envision a group, like your group therapy, with a nigger and a spick and a honky and a Polak and a paranoid Russian and an American sitting in a group, and I'm wondering if you gathered that these people, Fromm got quite a little criticism about that book, and I'm wondering if you're seeing characteristics, national characteristics that could be made into a model. He tried to use it on his model that fit your model, or that where your model would work on that.
I think I'd be reluctant to generalize too far, but it is true that when I'm in Brazil, I sort of expect people to be highly emotional, and they are. I found in Russia that they have a long history of being suspicious of people, a history that goes way back long before communism took root or anything. But any of those generalities, I think, are overshadowed by the fact that when you deal with any given group of people in that culture, you find plenty of people who do not fit the generalization you've made about them. I'll speak more about the Russians, but I don't... For instance, how would you characterize Americans? I don't know. To try to put one label on them would be absurd, because we all know there's so many exceptions to any label we would put. They're gregarious. Well, not all of them. They're relaxed. Well, anything you say that is of a general nature, you immediately think of all kinds of exceptions when you're thinking of a country you know. It's much easier, this is always much easier, it's much easier to put a label on somebody you don't know or on some nation you're not very familiar with. It's when you're close to them that you realize, well, the generalizations don't fit very well.
You've been emphasizing the personal, individual kinds of relationships. My great difficulty has always been the system, not the individual, because the individual acts very differently when he is within a system. I didn't have problems dealing with Russians who were very nicely and very friendly. I had problems dealing with the Russian system. How do you apply your theories to the system or individuals in a system?
I think that probably I'm somewhat deficient in fully appreciating a systems approach. I find the same thing you do, that, well, take an example. I find it much more difficult to deal with the educational system than I do in dealing with teachers. Teachers and professors are quite human beings when you get to know them. Sometimes I think the educational system sometimes stinks, would I dare say that? Because I might just digress there for a moment. We call ourselves a democratic country. That would be one thing that would characterize Americans. We're quite democratic. Are we? The educational system is the most hierarchical system I know, as it usually exists. There are, I'm glad to say, exceptions. But you'll find more participatory management in industry than you'll find in most educational systems. Hold the applause. Anyway, okay, I've forgotten where I was. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a little pessimistic about using empathetic listening in peace talks, for example. People, it seems to me, come into these peace talks with very strong motivations and very strong identities and egos tied up in their motivations, and for example, they're members of a country. They have a purpose, and this purpose has a lot of energy behind it. And to come in and try and be empathetic is to try and strip away some of that purpose, which I think they hold on to very dearly. How do you overcome something as strong as that? And how do you encourage empathy when these people really aren't motivated to be empathetic? There's too much to lose.
Okay, let me say two things. One will seem unrelated to your question. I think that it is difficult to use this kind of a model where they're not speaking for themselves. If they're, for instance, I've been told that diplomats can't say anything these days. They have to wait for the last phone call from Washington or Moscow or whatever. But they're really not speaking for themselves. They're speaking a line that has been given to them. Well, I'm talking about relationships where people are speaking for themselves. That's one reason I very carefully studied the Camp David experience, because they're the big three, Carter and Begin and Sadat, each had power enough in their own situation that they could speak for themselves and know that essentially they were speaking for their constituency. They still had to check back to be sure. But so I would agree that when people are purely speaking a party line, I don't mean by that just a communist line, it could be a U.S. line or a Brazilian line or anything, then the model I'm speaking about does not apply as well. As to your main question, it's just exactly people who are defensive, who are wrapped up in their own egos, that we do deal with in groups like this, and the process that I was describing is effective. I really would not hesitate to try to facilitate a dialogue between high U.S. officials and high Soviet officials. I can't guarantee that it would be successful. I would be quite sure that it would lead to more mutual understanding than existed at the outset, and less defensiveness than was present at the outset. So that's so I feel I am talking to the point you raised.
Dr. Rogers, I'm Jacques Girard, and a friend of mine recently was at the helm of a worldwide movement to end hunger, which is another motivation behind conflict, I would assume, from the petty theft to national movements. I'm still confused. Perhaps you could unconfuse me, because he hasn't been able to convince me that all the millions and millions and millions of dollars raised, not a grain of rice was sent to the hungry, but the millions were spent on creating awareness about the idea that it is time to end hunger. The question is, how does this apply with your particular theories on conflict and ending it?
Very easy to answer that. It doesn't apply. I know the movement you're speaking about. I'm sure they're operating from good intentions, but I prefer to deal with real persons, meeting real situations, not simply an awareness of problems out there. I feel that what you're talking about really does not apply to what I've been saying.
Thank you. I happen to agree. I wanted to hear it. Thank you.
I thought I caught the agreement in your voice.